It's the early 1970s. A young physics graduate named Robert Kelly arrives at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. It's a leafy campus on the edge of the San Francisco Bay Area. From the outside, you wouldn't guess that these unassuming buildings house America's premier institution for the research and development of nuclear weapons.
They have every discipline you can think of in terms of physics, metallurgy, engineering.
Robert's in the metallurgy division. He works with plutonium metal and makes bomb parts. The job is extremely hazardous. Every day he gets into a protective suit and works through a glove box, which is what it sounds like. A box with gloves embedded in it to keep the material at arm's length.
If you inhale it, you're in serious trouble. Now, a microscopic size piece can give you lung cancer within a few years.
As he gets to know the lab, Robert notices something strange about its different divisions.
The divisions at Livermore generally had a letter designation. W was weaponization. I was in metals and ceramics, M&C.
But there's a division at the end of the alphabet, Z division.
Z division just kind of stood out because it didn't stand for anything, and most of it had no idea what they did. It was in a building that had its own guards and things.
It's January 1978. The phone rings in Robert's office.
Got a phone call, said, "Will you please come to Z division? They're expecting you."
He rushes over to the mysterious building at the edge of campus, and the guards let him through. Then, he gets ushered into a conference room where about 20 people are sitting around a table.
They said, "We'd like your help on something. This is very confidential. You can't talk to anybody about it. There's a Soviet satellite that's out of control, has a nuclear reactor on board, and we expect it to return to Earth in a few days."
I was born in 1977, the same year that Cosmos 954 was launched. For me, the Cold War is something my parents lived through, but it was over before I even knew what it was. It's a strange thing, recent history that somehow feels like ancient history. Growing up in the communities around the big lake of Denendeh, I heard lots of stories about that time and what's happened in the years since. The caribou aren't moving in the same way, the fish have mutations, and trappers are getting rare diseases. Some people say that the problem started in the winter of '78. To piece together the puzzle of Cosmos 954, I knew I'd eventually have to visit some of the other communities around Denendeh, the massive lake at the heart of my homeland in Canada's far north. I wanted to hear from my people about how the land is changing. But somehow, that felt less intimidating than digging back into the Cold War archives to investigate how this story first began. I needed to understand why that satellite fell in the winter of '78. Who built it? Who launched it? And, most importantly, whose idea was it to put a nuclear reactor into a satellite? When I started asking these questions, I uncovered all the fear and paranoia of the Cold War, a war that came to the Canadian North and changed it forever. I'm Dëneze Nakehk'o. From Imperative Entertainment in Vespucci, this is Operation Morning Light. Episode 2, War Game.
Influencer. It's a word that gets tossed around a lot these days. There is a woman who went the distance, who broke ground as the first true influencer by living a remarkable life. Her name Elizabeth Taylor. I'm Katy Perry. This is the story of the original influencer. This is Elizabeth I.
Elizabeth I, the podcast, wherever you listen.
Influencer. It's a word that gets tossed around a lot these days. But what exactly is an influencer? Well, there is a woman who went the distance, who went beyond the dazzle, who broke ground as the first true influencer by living a remarkable life. She had power, real power, and longevity, influencing generations. Her name, Elizabeth Taylor.
I know she was loud. I know she was hysterically funny. I know she swore. But Elizabeth said how painfully shy she was.
She went on perfume tours, and the places were mobbed just to see her.
She was starting to try and take control of her life, but then tragedy and life kind of got in the way.
I'm Katy Perry, and Elizabeth Taylor has fascinated, inspired, and influenced me as an artist, woman, and an advocate. This is the story of the original influencer. This is Elizabeth I.
It's 5:48 p.m. on the Kazakh steppe, about 4 months before Z Division summons Robert Kelly. On this vast expanse of grassland that spans over 300,000 square miles in what is now Kazakhstan, closer to Afghanistan than Moscow, the towers of the Baikonur Cosmodrome look like a high-tech mirage. At this sprawling complex built in the 1950s, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first satellite. It's where Yuri Gagarin took flight on Vostok 1, becoming the first human in space. And it's here, on September 18th, 1977, that a brand new satellite is about to be sent into orbit. Its name is Cosmos 954. The rocket spews flame. Cosmos climbs higher and higher. The engineers celebrate as it disappears beyond the sky. In just a few minutes, the satellite reaches orbit, about 170 miles above the Earth. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, half a mile deep in the solid pink granite of a Colorado mountain, a new blip appears on the tracking system of NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command. It's an underground chamber where scientists track the 4,600 pieces of metal currently floating in space. That new blip is Cosmos 954. It looks like the Soviets just launched another satellite, and this time, it might jeopardize America's greatest advantage in this never-ending Cold War. These days, Robert Kelly is a distinguished fellow at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. I reached him at his home in Austria.
You're very lucky that the guys who've been digging trenches outside the house for 2 months just put the asphalt on today and rolled it. Otherwise, your room tone would be really loud.
Before Robert sets foot in the Livermore lab in the early 70s, he's worked in nuclear physics at the Nevada test site in Las Vegas. The scale of his projects in Nevada is almost unimaginable.
There was a giant reactor in the middle of the Nevada test site where the bombs are tested. It was the largest power reactor in the world in its time. We used that reactor as a simulant to simulate a bomb going off. So we would pulse the reactor just to the point of destroying it. And the radiation from the reactor then was used to irradiate things and see how they behaved. It was really fun. It was really fun.
On this day, in January 1978, it's his knowledge of nuclear reactors that brings him to Z Division. But who exactly are these people sitting around the table? It turns out that Livermore has a secret presence on campus.
It was the CIA's building at Livermore. and it was there to do all of the tasks the CIA wanted to do that involved nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons programs. Most of the people in Z Division had very high security clearances.
Robert takes a seat at the table, and they tell him this incredible story. Not long after the launch of Cosmos 954 in September, the scientists at NORAD noticed something weird. Instead of soaring smoothly through space, the satellite's orbit is wobbling. By November, it's circling the planet like it's surfing on waves. As soon as NORAD sees that, the question isn't if it's going to crash, but when. The Soviets refused to share any technical information about Cosmos.
In 1978, the Soviet scientists didn't talk to us.
So the Americans have to figure it out for themselves. By December, the satellite is still somewhat stable. That's the good news. If it stays like that, it won't fall until April, enough time to develop a plan. But the bad news? Turns out that Cosmos 954 is nuclear powered. The Soviets sent a fully fledged nuclear reactor into space. That's right, they sent a satellite with a nuclear reactor into the sky to orbit above us all. Why?
We christen this USS Ohio today to go in peace, to maintain peace, and pray that its awesome power will be a deterrent to any conflict in the future and never be used.
In the relentless arms race of the Cold War, the Americans are developing the Ohio-class submarine. These are the biggest submarines ever built by the U.S. Navy. They're designed to silently prowl the depths, and they can launch up to 24 thermonuclear weapons at a time.
It's a proud day for the United States Navy. It's a proud day for our country.
Imagine that. At the push of a button, a single submarine can reduce 24 cities to nuclear ash. The first Ohio submarine will be ready in a couple of years. In response to threats like this, the Soviets launched the RORSAT, or Radar Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite Program. This network of orbiting eyes will help them seek out America's silent predators. Cosmos 954 is one of the most powerful satellites of the RORSAT program.
Its job was to look for the wakes of ships crossing the ocean. So it had a very powerful radar, and it could look at the ocean and see a disturbance. So it would know if a ship were there and maybe even see traces of a submarine moving below the surface. The reason they had a reactor on board was there was no other way to power this powerful radar. Solar panels wouldn't work, batteries wouldn't work.
But now, the satellite itself doesn't work. A nuclear reactor is about to hit the atmosphere. No one knows if it will burn up or crash into the Earth. American authorities summoned the Soviet ambassador, but he's perfectly calm. He says, "Don't worry, Cosmos is explosive-proof." And besides, the Soviets can use a remote control to eject the nuclear core to a way higher position, 600 miles above the Earth, where it'll float safely for 600 years before burning out. That's what they do every time one of their nuclear satellites outlives its usefulness. Eventually, the Soviets push the button. Everybody waits, but nothing happens. The fail-safe plan failed. The latest estimate is that Cosmos will fall in April, but on January 6, 1978, things take a turn for the worse. The satellite isn't stable anymore. It's starting to tumble. It won't make it to April after all. It's going to be a matter of weeks. Nobody knows where it'll hit.
You just don't have the vaguest idea where it's coming down. They orbit the Earth every 90 minutes. So if you can't guess when the reentry is going to take place, that's the entire world.
The orbital path takes Cosmos over Australia, Britain, Canada, Japan, and New Zealand. The difference of a few minutes is the difference between continents. The possibilities are so endless, the American government decides not to tell the world about it. There would be mass panic if everyone thought their city was about to get vaporized. Now the CIA wants Robert to figure out what kind of reactors on board Cosmos and how it might break up when it enters the atmosphere. It's easier to predict the path of a pinball.
You have something like a satellite that's very irregularly shaped, and it starts hitting the Earth's atmosphere from the top. Maybe it has antennas that stick out, and the antennas burn off from friction, but then the satellite maybe bumps and jumps back up a little bit higher. And then it goes for another 30 minutes, and then it comes down. Well, it's gone halfway around the world again.
And remember, this was before the internet, so if you wanted to research anything on Soviet technology, you'd have to do it old school.
Went to the library and started pulling out card catalogs and pulling out reports. And you go to the classified library and you pull out classified cards and read classified reports. And did as much as we could in the couple of days that we had to try to make a guess.
In the end, there's almost nothing he can say for sure.
We could tell that it would have fuel rods. As the thing began to buffet and shake and break apart, those fuel rods would come out and melt, or at least partially melt, maybe break up and be scattered over a large area.
But that's the big question. What area? The crazy thing is that this isn't even the first time a nuclear satellite's fallen to Earth. It's actually happened 6 other times in the last 10 years. Two Soviet spacecraft burned up in the atmosphere on the way to the moon, and another Rörsat satellite dropped into the Pacific just north of Japan. And it's not just the Soviets. A US Navy navigation satellite with a nuclear power pack disintegrated over Madagascar. When Apollo 13 returned after its disastrous voyage, the astronauts had to jettison their moonlander, and its nuclear power pack hit the ocean near Australia. But none of them hit the land. Back at Livermore, the anticipation is almost unbearable.
This kind of work is something you dream of. I mean, it comes out of nowhere. It's very exciting. It's very different. No one has ever done it before that you know of.
Finally, the moment of truth. It's January 23rd, and NORAD says that Cosmos won't make it through the night. The latest prediction has it landing in the South Atlantic Ocean about 1,000 miles from Cape Town. Then they're saying the Marshall Islands. Then they're saying the Indian Ocean. Cosmos enters its 2059th orbit of Earth. It'll be its last.
All of a sudden, someone broke in on the news and said there's been some kind of a accident, a nuclear accident with a satellite. Stay tuned.
To the south of Dëneze, there's a lead zinc mine. Its biggest pit's called X15. It looks like a giant screw drilled into the earth and created a deep spiral of exposed crust. On January 27th, the night worker doesn't show up, so a young Dene woman named Violet Bailey ends up working a double shift. She's riding in a truck at the top of X15 when she sees something incredible in the sky.
First, I thought it was a UFO. You know, that's the first thought came to my mind. And then the second thought was it was a bomb.
The freak missile is streaking towards Fort Resolution, a settlement on the big lake where a lot of Violet's family lives.
I tried phoning home, there was no answer. All kinds of things are going through my mind. Am I going to see my kids again? Am I going to see my mom and dad?
Finally, Violet gets through to her brother Tommy, who's up late watching a movie on TV.
The phone rang and answered. It was my sister. Go outside, look outside. I looked out the window, I saw something like tail in the back, flaming, going.
This just start turning different color, like metal when it gets hot.
It's only after she gets off work and turns on the radio that she finds out what's going on.
This morning between 4:53 and 4:56 Yellowknife local time, the satellite did re-enter the atmosphere. It started to re-enter in a place near Great Slave Lake, at which point the tracking apparatus lost track of it because it fell below the horizon.
I realized that it couldn't be a jet because it had this long, fiery flame following it. And there were dozens and dozens of pieces following it, and they all had tails, long, fiery tails.
There is concern about the wildlife in the region, particularly caribou. If the spacecraft crashed and there is radiation, then the food supply for many native people could be affected.
Cosmos blazed across the subarctic sky at about 280 miles an hour. And even though few people saw it, they weren't necessarily seeing the same thing. One described an orange glow. Another watched bright sparks shoot off a vapor trail. Another saw a white light that burned red before it disappeared over the horizon. If Cosmos had gone around the Earth one more time, it would have hit close to New York City at the height of morning rush hour. Instead, it crashed into my homeland.
Good evening. Something scary happened yesterday, something science fiction buffs have been telling us for years was going to happen. A satellite with a nuclear reactor aboard fell out of the sky.
Even though people are scared, they just can't help but laugh at how absurd the whole situation is. It's the height of the Cold War, and everyone lives under the threat of nuclear annihilation. Cosmos feels like a sign of things to come. It becomes a running gag on Saturday Night Live.
Well, that Russian satellite filled with 100 pounds of highly radioactive uranium-235 has finally turned up in, of all places, a Nova Scotia lobster bed.
At the end of the episode, these huge mutant lobsters invade New York and storm the studio at 30 Rock. The audience screams, and Bill Murray opens fire on the atomic lobsters.
Oh, it's horrible! It's horrible! He had his whole life ahead of him! At least 2 or 3 more years, anyway.
Part of the joke is the idea of the Cold War coming to a remote place like the north of Canada. But the reality is, the North is already deeply involved.
Well, you're officially going to be our first interview for this.
Oh, okay. When I started looking for answers about Cosmos 954, one of the first people I went to see was this old prospector named Walt Humphreys. Everybody in Yellowknife knows Walt. He's been living here for decades. Besides prospecting, he paints these scenes of northern life. Some are pretty simple, cabins and wood stoves. Others are more surreal, like a giant sea creature dragging a boat down into the water. When I meet him, he's got a big white beard, bright blue eyes, and he's wearing a Pink Floyd t-shirt. He's chewing a piece of gum.
I'm always looking for odd, curious, weird things. So, best find maybe a feather for the day. Maybe, an old skull of an animal, maybe an interesting looking rock.
For Walt, prospecting isn't just about making money. It's a way to relate to the land, going slow, noticing everything.
This winter I found this. It's a little sealskin mitten that the fox had chewed on the end of.
That's a sweet little mitten, just in the bush.
So, to me, that's a great find.
It was a good thing that I dropped by when I did, because Walt was only in town for a couple days before heading back out to his cabin. That's one thing about the people here. You either catch them or you don't. And if you don't, it could be months before they show up again. I asked Walt to take me back and explain how the North saw its place in the Cold War.
We were quite cognizant of the fact that if a nuclear war started, what the Americans and what the Russians sent at each other goes right over top of us here. We're ground zero of where the missiles and the interceptors would meet.
Despite what people down south might think, back in 1978, the Cold War wasn't just an abstract idea to us. The North is like a giant arena that gives the superpowers the space they need to flex. People might be out ice fishing or hunting seals and hear the signals of Russian submarines deep below the ice patrolling the waters.
I remember one day out in the Barrens, sitting there all by myself off in a traverse, and looking up at the sky, and all of a sudden I see a B-52 bomber come out of the clouds. Holy crap! And then there's two little jet fighters behind it. And then over here, I see a jet fighter coming the other way. And they were having a war game going on. The Canadian, American military.
Canada and America might be on the same team in the Cold War, but when it comes to sharing intelligence about Cosmos 954, the Americans play it close to the chest. Here's Robert Kelly again.
The Canadians had no idea that the event was going to take place. So they probably got a phone call saying a Soviet reactor has disintegrated and it looks like it landed in the Northwest Territories.
He's right. The former Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, the father of Canada's current Prime Minister, later admitted that he was briefed on the malfunctioning satellite, but he hadn't taken it too seriously. He told reporters, "If Moscow had told me that maybe it was going to fall in Canada, then I'd say, let me go back to sleep. If it looks like it's going to fall on my country, call me back again." But now it has fallen on his country. This is Trudeau on the day of the crash, briefing the Canadian Parliament on what U.S. President Jimmy Carter told him.
The President of the United States phoned me sometime around 7 o'clock this morning, said that they had it in their radar and that it was about to land, and indicated where he thought the landing would be. The real reason why the President was phoning me, Mr. Speaker, was to offer to the Canadian forces, should they need it, airborne detecting devices for any possible radioactivity.
The Canadians quickly accept the offer, but the reason America's eager to find radioactivity isn't to help people clean up their land. Back at Z Division, CIA officials are excited that Cosmos 954 didn't land in the ocean. Even better, it crashed in Canada, a Cold War ally.
There's always interest in collecting intelligence on somebody else's system. If there was a possibility of learning something, that would be part of the game, of course.
The Soviets launched the Rorsat program to spy on American vessels. Now, one of these sophisticated satellites has literally fallen into enemy hands. A massive operation gets underway to locate whatever pieces they can find. America deploys a U-2 aircraft to scan for radioactive debris, while Canada readies its own fleet of airplanes and helicopters. In Washington, a Department of Energy computer gets tasked with randomly generating a code name for the operation. It spits out the words, "Morning Light," a surprisingly fitting moniker for the satellite that lit up the morning sky. Meanwhile, up in Yellowknife, Cosmos is the talk of the town. These days, people around here mostly keep in touch on Facebook. But in 1978, the social hub is a place called the Miner's Mess. It's a self-serve coffee shop that looks like the dining hall of a work camp, with pickaxes on the wall and long communal tables that force people into making conversation. Walt Humphreys is a regular.
It was the gossip center by far, of Yellowknife.
The Miner's Mess is where prospectors congregate. Sometimes they share information about the land. Other times, they try to safeguard their discoveries by throwing the other guys off the scent.
Every once in a while, I'd go over to the mining recorder's office, and I would buy a couple random claim maps, roll them up when I walk over to the Miner's Mess, and I'd put them on the table while I went and got my coffee. Because I know sure as hell the guys would be looking at them to see what claim numbers, what sheet numbers they were, because they would think I'm going out working in that area.
He remembers the morning after Cosmos fell.
And the Miner's Mess, it was the hot topic. Everybody was talking about it.
This little coffee shop percolates the rumors that'll eventually hit the airwaves.
The satellite's disintegrated reactor produced a nuclear cloud some 40 miles up in atmosphere.
It may take weeks before these particles reach the Earth's surface, and when they do, they'll be spread over an area from the equator to about the 55th parallel. Soviet scientists think the nuclear reactor would have burned when it entered the atmosphere. It appears a part of the reactor may still be intact.
Anything coming within 1,000 feet could be harmed.
All of Yellowknife's hotels are already packed with reporters looking for a piece of the action. Walt's name's listed in the phone book as a prominent prospector, and he ends up becoming an unofficial spokesman for the North.
I was starting to get phone calls from reporters in New York and London, England, and various places who wanted some background on Yellowknife. Where was it? What was it like? Could they rent a boat and go out and see the spot? And try to explain to them there were 6 feet of ice in the lake. Renting a boat wouldn't do you much good.
With all this activity in town, the editor of the local newspaper jokes that the Russians have contributed more to Yellowknife in a few days than the Canadian government has in a whole year. And then, like a war game that suddenly becomes reality, the American and Canadian militaries surge up from the south.
The United States Air Force are providing 4 specialized aircraft, at least 2 Canadian Forces Hercules aircraft. We're going to be doing a low-altitude search. A number of other aircraft will be called in to do a visual search. And at this moment, the U-2 and the KC-135 tanker airplane, which is accompanying it, have in fact just at this moment arrived to commence their search.
The North has never seen anything like it. Operation Morning Light has begun. That's next time. Operation Morning Light is a production of Imperative Entertainment in Vespucci and is hosted by me, Dëneze Nakehk'o. I wrote it with Michael LaPointe. For Imperative Entertainment, the executive producer is Jason Hoch. For Vespucci, the executive producers are Daniel Turcan, Johnny Galvin, and Michael LaPointe. The series producer is Aliya Pabani. The story editor is Matt Willis. Thomas Curry is the managing producer. Audio mix and sound design by Alice Boyd. Our closing theme is Siga Dante by Digawolf off his album Inni Spirit. And this episode was recorded at his studio, Knockout Productions.